The mid-engine, rear-wheel drive configuration can be considered the original layout of automobiles. Early automobiles were essentially horseless carriages, and the only way to add an engine was under the passengers. This video presents some of the long history of mid-engine vehicles as they have evolved over time into sophisticated, high-performance motor vehicles.
Is late to his final rest when she hears a bugle calling and the boys go marching by. Then her tears are gently falling from her heart. There comes a sigh. By the fireside she is dreaming they will meet someday perhaps. While amid the campfire gleaming lies a little boy called Jack.
The Olds engine is a one-cylinder, 4.5 horsepower unit placed transversely in the chassis. The engine is connected to a planetary gearbox that provides a low gear and reverse. Final drive is taken by chain to a differential on the rear axle. The tension in the chain is adjustable.
Huge flywheels, like 130 pounds I believe. And here you have your transmission, and this is your shifter.
Again, simplicity. This is something that could be repaired or worked on by your local blacksmith, because obviously large Oldsmobile dealerships didn't exist in that era. So once this was shipped to you and you had it, you were a little bit on your own. A curb dash Olds, that's it. That exemplifies the old primitive cars. It's a great car.
Towards the end, the last ones they built are the curb dash Olds from 1907. And the 05s are, the only thing you can't see is the smell of the exhaust.
Cars now became a more and more frequent sight, particularly in cities. By 1903, there were more than 1,000 automobile manufacturers in the United States. And in that year, the Ford Motor Company was founded. The first car of the new little company was called the Model A. It had a 2-cylinder, 8-horsepower engine, and it could go 30 miles an hour. It sold for $850, a lot of money in those days, and its owners were chiefly in the upper brackets. It was smart and fashionably designed, with a door in the rear like a pony cart. And a crank safety measure designed to prevent the cranker from being knocked flat and run over if the car started prematurely.
Once I got over the shock of it being red, and then, you know, it's interesting too. It's a rear entry here, and it's very cool. There's and two cylinders and 8 horsepower.
do in today's video is look at an extraordinary car, the Rumpler Tropfenwagen of 1921. Tropfenwagen in German means teardrop car, and it's really the first aerodynamic low drag special car ever made, and it was actually a production car. Here is the car in 1979 in the Volkswagen wind tunnel. It had a CD, a drag coefficient of just 0.28, and its frontal area was just 2.57 square meters. Taken from a contemporary brochure, this shows the rear of the car. It used a mid-mount engine. You can see there that the engine is ahead of the rear wheels. The gearbox is behind, so the transaxle we should perhaps call it. So it's a mid-mount car. So remember, the engine is towards the front of the car, it's in the middle of the car. Here's the transaxle behind. We've got drive shafts there, we've got a rear support there, giving effectively a triangular wishbone, and then we had leaf springs that came forward. So swing arm rear suspension, the first car that I'm aware of with a swing arm rear suspension in the world. And of course, every other car had solid suspension, solid axles, although the Tropfenwagen did in fact have a solid front arm. Looking at the back of the Tropfenwagen, you can see that they clearly went for a teardropped design, what we'd now call boat tailing, the rear of the car coming together towards a single point, or in this case a single vertical axis that we can see there. An exhaust pipe actually comes out at that point, a really nice elegant design aspect, and you can see also the cabin is teardropped towards the rear as well. And a view from the brochure, you can very much see the teardrop shape of the car, of the main body. You can also see that sophisticated suspension, that sophisticated engine and its location. This car really showed the way for racing cars as well. Auto Union in the 20s and 30s took a lot of these ideas and applied them to their very successful racing cars, including the swing arm rear suspension and including the aerodynamics. They made more than one model. This is the long wheelbase version. You can see, in fact, it's got spoked wheels, whereas the other one had flat disc wheels.
And it fascinated me that I could look at the front of the car and be looking at a differential cover. And basically the engine is just in there backwards with the transmission and differential in front instead of behind. It's a big, heavy car, 137-inch wheelbase, 4,400 pounds. But the profile is 3 to 4 inches lower than any other car built in that era. We've worked 5 to 6 years on the restoration with a professional restorer. Indiana was really one of the automotive capitals of the world back in the 20s and 30s and early teens. More auto companies were in Indiana than any other state. And this is one of the premium cars that was built in Indiana, along with the Duesenbergs and the Stutz and the Marmons and things like that.
This is a 1930 Cord L29 Speedster. It's the only car ever built like this. Brooks Stevens bought this car new when he was 26 years old. He designed this car to be a sporty car that he could take to hill climbs, races, sporting events, golfing. The gear shift lever in the center is because the car has front wheel drive, the engine is mounted in the car backwards. So the transmission is way up front. And this has gears, levers and gears going all the way up to the front of the engine. And it's actually a lot easier to shift than you would think. It's a typical H pattern, except it's in reverse. The handling is very, very sprightly. We happen to have another L29 right next to it, which is in its original configuration. And I've driven both cars extensively, and this car actually feels a lot more nimble and drives better than the original configuration. And again, you can see the engine is in backwards, but he also, like I say, designed the manifold for dual carburetors.
A number of years ago, when this car had just returned from Pebble Beach and had only had 100 miles on the restoration, we videotaped a drive Ed had with his wife Judy.
The company's founder, André Citroen. Citroen's automotive ambitions were also inspired by Henry Ford, whom he'd met before the war while helping the Morse Motor Company streamline its production methods. Ford's assembly line system for making the Model T fitted closely with Citroen's ideas about efficient production and mass-market sales. In 1934, Citroën decided essentially blending all the technologies he'd pioneered and popularized with a few even more radical ideas.
He had borrowed some ideas from America, from Henry Ford, and his idea was to present in a single car a revolutionary step to the future. And he put all his money on the line and did just that.
André Citroën's revolutionary step was the introduction of a technology practically unknown at the time, front-wheel drive. Up to this point, virtually all cars were pushed along by the rear wheels. Though front-wheel drive offered considerable advantages of traction and stability, the technical obstacles had kept all but a very few car makers from attempting it. But in 1933, at least a quarter century ahead of his time, André Citroën wanted a car of completely new design, with no components carried over from earlier vehicles. The new car was introduced in 1934, descriptively named the Traction Avant, or front drive. None of these features were absolutely new in a production automobile, but it was the first time that they'd been offered together in a single car. Like the Rosalie, the Traction used welded unibody construction, the strength of which Citroën promoted by once again pushing the car off a cliff, and this time driving it away. The styling of the Traction, offered in both sedan and convertible versions, certainly was a giant step forward. Front drive and the absence of a drive shaft permitted designer Flaminio Bertoni to set the Traction quite low to the ground. The Traction's sleek lines and distinctively sloping radiator grille made it look as if it were moving, even when it was standing still. Many in the press and public regarded it as sensational, an engineering masterpiece. When it was introduced in 1934, the Traction was the most technologically advanced production car in the world.
The concept of the front-wheel drive was going to provide the world with a new definition of the automobile. It is so new, so bold, the press was writing, so rich in original solutions, so different from what has ever been done, that it deserves the epithet of sensational. 50 years later, this opinion remains unchanged.